Audio Lecture 4 Absolutism in Western Europe, 1589 to 1715. Key concept. Key concept. All right, first of all, a definition of absolutism. Absolutism is derived from the traditional assumption of power, like the heirs to the throne, and the belief in the divine right of kings. Louis XIV of France was the quintessential absolute monarch, believing that he was destined by God to have his power. Characteristics of Western European absolutism. The sovereignty of a country was embodied in the person of the ruler, rather than the people. Absolute monarchs were not subordinate to national assemblies or legislatures. The nobility was effectively brought under control as well. This, of course, started with the new monarchs and would continue with the absolute monarchs. This contrasts, however, Eastern European absolutism, which we'll talk about in a later lecture, where the nobility remained powerful, and instead the absolute power of the kings was dependent upon the support of the nobility to keep them in that position. We will talk about this in Russia. The nobility could still at times prevent absolute monarchs from completely having their way as a result in Eastern Europe. However, in Western Europe, especially in France, the nobility will be completely under the control of the monarch. Bureaucracies, or I guess you would say the people working in the government for the monarch, the bureaucracies in the 17th century were often composed of career officials appointed by and solely accountable to the king. Many of them will come from the upper middle class. They often were rising members of this upper middle class called the bourgeoisie, or as Louis XIV will call them, the new nobility, or the nobles of the robe, those who purchased their titles from the king himself. The French and Spanish monarchies gained effective control of the Roman Catholic Church in their countries as well. They maintained large standing armies during peacetime. Monarchs no longer relied on mercenaries or on noble armies, as had been the case in the 15th century and earlier. They also employed secret police forces to weaken their political opponents, usually in addition to a spy network to keep tabs on everyone. This, of course, kind of foreshadows the totalitarianism of the 20th century that we'll get to eventually in this course. But it lacked the financial and technological and military resources of the 20th century dictators like Stalin and Hitler. In the most basic way of explaining it, absolutism did not really delve into changing the hearts and minds of the people and controlling the way they thought. Totalitarian dictators will count on indoctrination of the public in order to keep their people in line. And they are able to do this because they have the technology to do so, because they happen after the Industrial Revolution. Absolute monarchs usually did not require total mass participation in support of the monarch's goals. This is in stark contrast to totalitarian programs such as collectivization in Russia and the Hitler Youth in Nazi Germany, both of which we'll discuss much later in the course. Those who did not overtly oppose absolute monarchs, did not overtly oppose the state, were usually left alone by the government. If you were passive and just didn't overtly oppose them, they didn't care if you thought differently than they did. Political thought that is behind the rise of absolute monarchy. First, we have Jean Bodin, 1530 to 1596. He was among the first to provide a theoretical basis for absolutist states. He lived and wrote during the chaos of the French Civil Wars, meaning the wars of religion, during the late 16th century, and the Wars of the Three Henries that were what brought that finally to an end. He believed that only absolute government could provide order and force people to obey the government. Then we have Thomas Hobbes, a British man who wrote his quintessential book on supporting absolute monarchy called The Leviathan, 1651. He articulated a pessimistic view of human beings in a state of nature. He said, in a state of nature, men live a solitary life, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Anarchy results from chaos. The central drive in every person, he argued, is power. So, therefore, an absolute monarch is necessary to put a cap on that drive, that selfish drive in every person that will lead to chaos in the long run. The absolute monarch is the only one who could guarantee that that would not happen. He also stated that political sovereignty is actually derived from the people, but that the people transfer it to an absolute monarch by implicit contract. He did not believe in the divine right theory of kings, like Jean Bodin and most of the absolute monarchs. He instead believed that the power, rather than coming from God, came from the people, but the people gave that power to the monarch in exchange for law and order. But once they gave that power to the monarch, they could never take it back. They couldn't rebel against that monarch. This will be quite different than what we will see with other political theorists who believed in natural laws and natural rights, like John Locke, whom we'll talk about later. Hobbes justified absolute monarchy, therefore, but not divine right. His ideas became most closely identified with Voltaire in the 18th century, with his support of enlightened despotism. We'll talk more about that in a later unit. Hobbes was not popular in the 17th century, however. Even the absolute monarchists didn't like him because they didn't like the idea of power actually coming from the people originally. They believed that they got their power directly from God. Hobbes did not favor that divine right of kings, as was favored by people like Louis XIV of France and James I and Charles I in England, whom we'll talk about later. Those with constitutional ideas saw Hobbes' ideas as too authoritarian, like Locke. This is the title page from Hobbes' Leviathan, 1651. Bishop Jacques-Bénigne Bossuet is another supporter of the idea of absolute monarchies. He is a principal advocate of divine right of kings during the reign of Louis XIV. He believed that divine right meant the king was placed on the throne by God and therefore owed his authority to no man or group. Now, let's talk about the development of French absolutism. France in the 17th century, the 1600s. In the feudal tradition, French society was divided into three estates made up of various classes. The first estate was the clergy. They made up about 1% of the population. The second estate was the nobility. They made up between 3 and 4% of the population. And the third estate was the bourgeoisie, the artisans, the urban workers, and the peasants, making up roughly 95% of the population. Here is an illustration of 17th century French society. The hierarchy of the social orders, the estates, was based on rank and privilege and had been restored under the reign of Henry IV, who used to be Henry of Navarre. Henry IV was the one who had begun the Bourbon dynasty, you will recall. Society was primarily agrarian, meaning based on farming. 90% of the population lived in the countryside. And France did have the largest population in all of Europe, 17 million people. As a matter of fact, France comprised about 20% of the entire European population. This accounted for France becoming the strongest nation in Europe as we move into the 17th century. Now, you will recall Henry IV. He reigned from 1589 to 1610. He laid the foundation for France becoming the strongest European power in the 17th century with his founding of the Bourbon dynasty. He strengthened the social hierarchy by strengthening government institutions. First of all, the Parlement were the councils of noble judges. Yes, he will suppress the power of nobles, but he will handpick nobles that support him to man the parlements, the judiciary. The treasury and universities and the Catholic Church were also strengthened um, by Henry IV, but still under his control. He was the first king also to actively encourage French colonization to the New World, and this will stimulate the Atlantic trade and bring more wealth into France as a result. He's also, as I said before, the first king of the Bourbon dynasty. He came to power in 1589 as a part of a political compromise to end the French Civil Wars. He also converted from Calvinism as a Huguenot to Catholicism in order to gain recognition from Paris, the capital city of his reign, but also the majority of the people in France. He was the one that said Paris is worth a mess. He then, however, wanted to make sure that that the Huguenots that had been one of were protected, that their freedom of religion was protected. So he issued the Edict of Nantes in 1598, providing a degree of religious toleration to the Huguenots. No longer could you be persecuted for being a Huguenot living in France. Now, the weakening of the nobility. The old nobles of the sword, as they were known, meaning the old traditional nobles from back in the medieval times, they were the ones that were the knights, remember? So that's why they call them nobles of the sword. They had controlled the military for many years, but no more. Those old nobles of the sword were not allowed to influence the royal council whatsoever. Many of the new nobles of the robe, new nobles who had purchased their titles from the monarchy, from Henry IV himself, became high officials in the government and remained loyal to the king, like the Duke of Sully, who we'll talk about more later. They had been commercially successful members of the bourgeoisie, and now they sought to raise their social status along with their wealth. So these were upper middle class men who now purchased their noble status and became the new nobility, the nobles of the robe. The Duke of Sully was the finance minister for Henry IV. His reforms ultimately enhanced the power of the monarchy by bringing more wealth into France. He established a very complicated but important mercantilist system. Now, remember, mercantilism was the economic theory where the increased role of the state in the economy was there in order to achieve a favorable balance of trade with other countries. More wealth coming in, less wealth going out, but instead of it being free trade, it was dictated by the government, by the king. The Duke of Sully, as the finance minister, granted monopolies in the production of gunpowder and salt to bring more wealth into France. And he encouraged the manufacturing also of silk and tapestries. The government monopolized mining as well. This helped Henry IV to reduce the royal debt. They also employed systematic bookkeeping and budgets to stay on track. In contrast, Spain by this point was drowning in debt, especially after the failed Spanish Armada. The Duke of Sully also helped to reform the tax system to make it more equitable and efficient. He also oversaw improved transportation throughout France, more roads being built that helped to make trade move more freely throughout the kingdom. He began a nationwide highway system. Canals linked major rivers as well. And he began a canal to link the Mediterranean Sea to the Atlantic Ocean. Henry IV, however, was assassinated in 1610 by a fanatical monk who sought revenge for Henry's granting of religious toleration. And this led to a severe crisis in power for this very new Bourbon dynasty. Henry's widow, Marie de Medici, aka Margaret Valois, ruled as regent until their son, Louis XIII, came of age. Key concept. Louis XIII, he reigned from 1610 to 1643, although he had the regency of his mother helping him before he became of age. As a youth, his regency was plagued by corruption and mismanagement. Marie de Medici, aka Margaret Valois, was not as good as a regent as her mom, Catherine de Medici, had been. Feudal nobles ultimately ended up increasing their power despite the actions that Henry IV had taken to reduce their power. Certain nobles even convinced Louis XIII, as a young man, to assume power and exile his mother, thinking they could control him. Cardinal Richelieu, however, came to the aid of Louis XIII. We talked about Cardinal Richelieu in the last unit with the 30 Years' War. Cardinal Richelieu ultimately laid the foundation for absolutism in France. Like Henry IV, he was a politique. He placed political issues ahead of religious principles in order to build a stronger state for France and a stronger monarchy for Louis XIII. He established the Intendant system, which was used to weaken the nobility that had tried to gain more power while Louis XIII was younger. He replaced local officials with intendants who reported directly to the king and to Richelieu. The intendants were largely middle class or nobles of the robe. Each of the country's 32 districts had an intendant responsible for the justice, for the police, and for the finance in that area. And if they did not toe the line to what the king or Richelieu wanted, then they would be in trouble and would lose their position of power. The government became more efficient and centrally controlled as a result of the intendant system. Richelieu also built upon the Duke of Sully's economic achievements in further developing mercantilism. He increased taxation to fund the military, although his tax policies were not as successful as Sully's. He restored the old system of selling offices ultimately. And tax farmers ruthlessly exploited the peasantry as a result. Richelieu did, however, subdue the Huguenots within France, even though he was supporting the fight against Catholics in the 30 Years' War. Remember, the 30 Years' War was about politics by that point, not by the French phase, not about religion. The Peace of Alais in 1629 was where the Huguenots had lost some of their fortified cities and Protestant armies that had been guaranteed under Henry IV's reign with with his religious toleration that he had allowed with the Edict of Nantes. Calvinist aristocratic people, their influence was reduced greatly. Huguenots, however, were still allowed to practice Calvinism, but their political and social power decreased. Now, remember the 30 Years' War, the French phase. Cardinal Richelieu's fingerprints were all over that. Richelieu and Louis XIII sought to weaken the Habsburg Empire and therefore strengthen the French kingdom. They reversed Marie de Medici's pro-Spanish policies. They declared war against Spain in 1635 and thus also war against the Holy Roman Emperor in the 30 Years' War. France supported Gustavus Adolphus with money during the Swedish phase of the war as well. Later, France entered the international phase, or the French phase, of the war and ultimately forced the Treaty of Westphalia on the Habsburgs by wearing them down in the War of Attrition. Key concept. Now let's talk about Louis XIV. The foundations had been laid by Henry IV and then by Louis XIII via Cardinal Richelieu for Louis XIV to really become the first or quintessential true absolute monarch in France. He will reign from 1643 to 1715, a long reign, the quintessential absolute ruler in European history that other absolute monarchs all over Europe will try to copy. He personified the idea that the sovereignty of the state resides in the ruler, not in the people. He was very famous for having said, "L'état c'est moi," or "I am the state." He was also known as the Sun King, as he was at the center of French power, and his rays of light and glory shine throughout the entire nation. He was a strong believer in divine right, in the divine right theory, which was advocated by Bishop Bossuet. Here is Louis XIV in one of his most famous royal portraits that was painted in 1701. He had the longest reign in European history, 72 years. Remember, a long reign normally means that you have a better legacy because you have more time to correct your mistakes. He inherited the throne when he was only 5 years old. Needless to say, he had to have a regent. France became, however, under his reign, the undisputed major power in Europe during his reign. France's large population, remember, 20% of all of Europe, of all the European population, lived in France. France's large population meant that a massive standing army could be created and maintained to keep France strong. French culture will also come to dominate all of Europe under Louis XIV's reign. Everybody wants to copy French style and French culture. The French language became the international language in Europe for over 2 centuries and the language of the well educated, as Latin had been in the Middle Ages. France became the epicenter of literature and the arts until the 20th century. Key concept. So let's talk about the early days of Louis XIV's reign, the Fronde. This is in the mid to late 1640s. Now, as I said before, Louis became king when he was only 5 years old, so he had to have a regent. His regent was Cardinal Jules Mazarin, who controlled France when Louis XIV was a child as his regent. Cardinal Mazarin was trying to follow in the footsteps of the earlier Cardinal Richelieu and what he had done to build up the power of the king under Louis XIII. Now, in the mid 1640s, however, some of the old nobles, the sword nobles, if you will, revolted against Mazarin and therefore against Louis XIV. This caused a civil war among various noble factions, but it enabled Mazarin ultimately to defeat those nobles and to strengthen the power of Louis XIV. Louis never, however, forgot the humiliation he faced at the hands of the nobles. The Fronde revolt actually for a while was a bit scary. The nobles were actually able to break into the Tuileries Palace in Paris, where Louis was living as the child king, and they broke into his bedrooms, threatening his life. It scared him, and he never forgot that humiliation and that fear. And instead, he let it drive him to be more and more determined to control those nobles so he could never be put in that kind of fearful position again. This is a Baroque portrait of Louis XIV as Jupiter conquering the Fronde. Now, of course, he himself didn't conquer the Fronde. It was done by Mazarin, but of course, it was done in his name since Mazarin was his regent. Government organization under Louis XIV. Louis XIV, once he came to power outright himself, recruited his chief ministers from the bourgeoisie, or the upper middle class, in order to keep the aristocrats, nobility, out of the government. He continued the Intendant system that had been begun by Richelieu as well, which also utilized uh, those robe nobles, which were, of course, the upper middle class. He checked the power of institutions that might challenge him as well. The Parlement, which were fearful of resisting him after the failure of the Fronde, he was able to control. Officials who criticized the government could be arrested and oftentimes were put to death. He managed to use his power to intimidate anybody who might try to challenge him. He never ever called the Estates General, which had been a kind of advisory body to previous kings in France in the past. He will not give the Estates General the satisfaction of asking for their advice on anything. An absolute monarch never has to ask for advice. Now, control over the peasantry. Remember, they were 95% of the population. Some peasants kept as little as 20% of their cash crops after paying their landlord, the government, taxes, and church tithes. That means that the peasantry were extremely poor in France. The corvée required peasants to work for a month out of each year on government projects like roads and other public projects, including the building of the fabulous Versailles Palace that Louis XIV will build. This is another way he was able to maintain control over them to keep them from rebelling, even though they were so poor and downtrodden. Idle peasants could be conscripted into the army as well, or forced into workhouses. Rebellious peasants could be executed or used as galley slaves on ships. So he will be able to keep them in line as well. Keep the nobles in line, keep the peasants in line, and then promote the middle class to work for him. Key concept. Versailles Palace is probably the crowning achievement domestically of Louis XIV. It's the grandest and most impressive palace in all of Europe. In fact, it's more than a palace, it's a small city. And it also stood to reinforce his image as Europe's most powerful ruler. It had Baroque architecture. The cost of maintaining it was ultimately 60% of all royal revenues every year of Louis's reign. The facade was about 1/3 of a mile long, and it had 1,400 fountains. The royal court ultimately grew to about 10,000 people living at Versailles at any given time. Versailles Palace became a pleasure prison for the aristocracy. Let me explain what we mean by that. Louis gained absolute control over the nobility by requiring them to live with him at Versailles for a certain number of months each year. He required them to live there, and this ultimately kept them under his watchful eye so they could not rebel against him and try to challenge his power. Yes, they were living in the lap of luxury. They were entertained with numerous recreational activities such as tournaments, hunts, and concerts. But they were also forced to pay for the pleasure to live there. So, yes, he forces them to live there. But all of these activities require fine clothing. He required them to gamble with money. So he basically bankrupt the nobility by forcing them to live there with him. Yes, they lived in the apartments in Versailles, but they had to pay to keep up appearances to participate in all of the activities which were required of them. If they did not attend the activities, they could then be seen as committing treason against the king and be imprisoned or even executed. It's pretty brilliant if you think about it. Versailles Palace in 1722. Again, like I say, it's more than really a palace, it's a small city. A view of the palace from the garden with the fountains. And here's the interior court at the Palace of Versailles. Here is the famous Hall of Mirrors. Talk about Baroque architecture, gold and glass everywhere to show the power and the grandeur of Louis XIV. Now, what about his religious policies? To gain control over the church and to gain control over religion, Louis, of course, considered himself the head of the French Catholic Church, not the Pope. He did not allow the Pope to exercise political power in the French Church at all. He revoked also the Edict of Nantes, which Henry IV had enacted, with the Edict of Fontainebleau in 1685. By revoking the Edict of Nantes, he now refused to allow French Huguenots to practice Protestantism. Huguenots lost their right to practice Calvinism, and about 200,000 Huguenots fled France as a result. Many of them will come to the New World, including here to Florida. Huguenot Park is named after some of the Huguenots that landed here near Fort Caroline. Huguenots later supported the Enlightenment and toleration, and the ones that remain in France had to basically become underground Calvinists, could not practice their faith openly. In fact, if they were suspected of being a Calvinist, they could be in big trouble and be arrested and maybe even executed for treason. Louis supported the Jesuits in cracking down on the Jansenists, Catholics who held some Catholic views. Calvinist views. Key concept. Mercantilism. Okay, this is how he gained control over the economy. He continued the mercantilist policies that had been started by Henry IV and then, of course, by Louis XIII via Richelieu, but he will take it even further. State control over a country's economy to achieve a favorable balance of trade, remember, is the basic definition of mercantilism. Bullionism was also part of this, a nation's policy of accumulating as much precious metal or bullion as possible while preventing its outward flow to other countries. So what Louis did was that he hired Louis hired Jean-Baptiste Colbert to be his new finance minister. So French mercantilism will reach its peak, its height, under Colbert. Colbert's goal was to create an economic self-sufficiency for France. And remember, Louis needed lots of money for the building of that palace and maintaining his armies because he was at war for most of his reign. Colbert oversaw construction of even more roads and canals than Richelieu and the Duke of Sully had done before. He granted government-supported monopolies in certain industries, tax breaks to certain industries to build up those industries. These were things that could also help to build the economy of France ultimately. Colbert also heavily regulated the guilds and reduced internal tariffs that had inhibited trade within France. He also organized French trading companies for international trade. An East India Company, a West India Company, but these were French East India and French West India companies, much like we saw the British and the Dutch had as well. He also forbade the export of foodstuffs. This was a wise move. They would not export, even though exporting was considered a good part of mercantilism, foodstuffs were not one of the exports that the French would advocate. And this was because they had such a large population. They needed to maintain the foodstuffs in their country to feed that large population. By 1683, France was Europe's leading industrial country. France excelled in such industries as textiles or cloth, mirrors, lace making, and foundries for steel manufacturing and firearms. Colbert's most important accomplishment was developing the merchant marine. A merchant marine, of course, is a fleet of ships that were specifically designed for trade rather than for like a navy. The military buildup, however, will happen, and it also stimulates the economy. They need to make uniforms, overcoats, weapons, and ammunition for the military. Remember what I said, Louis was at war almost all of his reign, and we'll talk about the wars of Louis here in just a moment. Drawbacks, however, of mercantilism and the French economy do need to be analyzed as well. Poor peasant conditions, especially the heavy taxation that was mentioned before, ultimately got worse under Colbert's policies, and it resulted in large immigration of many of those peasants out of France. Louis opted for creating a massive army instead of a formidable navy as well. Spent more money on the army rather than a navy, and ultimately will not be able to challenge England as well because of it. The result was France later lost many naval wars with England, as we'll talk about later. War in the later years of Louis's reign ultimately nullified Colbert's gains for the economy. So much money was spent on the wars of Louis that ultimately, even with the financial policies put in place by Colbert, the country was still spending more than it could bring in. Louis was at war for almost all of his reign. Like I said, 2/3 of his long reign, he was at war. Key concept. Let's talk about the wars of Louis XIV now. An overview first. The wars were initially successful, but eventually economically ruinous for France. France created, however, a professional modern army as a result of these wars, a formidable army. Perhaps for the first time in modern European history, that a single country was able to dominate politics throughout most of Europe because of this army. The balance of power system in Europe ultimately emerged in response to the threat posed by Louis. Louis was doing all he could to upset that balance of power that had been put in place after the 30 Years' War, to try to tilt it more in favor of France. So the rest of the European nations will try to challenge that. No one country would be allowed to dominate the continent, since a coalition of other countries would rally against a threatening power. That's what we see happen through most of the wars of Louis. The Dutch stadtholder William of Orange, later King William III of England. This will be the William of Orange Jr., I guess you would say, the later one, not the earlier one that we talked about with William the Silent. But anyways, that challenged Spain, by the way. This William of Orange, the later William of Orange, was the most important figure in thwarting Louis's expansionism. Now, this was all before he becomes the King of England. We'll talk more about that later with the Glorious Revolution. Let's talk about the first war of Louis the 14th, the War of Devolution, also known as the First Dutch War, 1667 to 68. Louis invaded the Spanish Netherlands, the Belgium part, without declaring war. Eventually, he overwhelmed them so much they did not know what hit them that the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle was declared. France got 12 towns on the Spanish Netherlands border as a result. But they had to give up Franche-Comté or Burgundy, part of Burgundy, to Spain. So it was a draw, a compromise. Louis got what he wanted, though. He wanted those border towns because they had a lot more wealth coming in. The Dutch War, 1672 to 78. Louis this time invaded the southern Netherlands as revenge for the Dutch opposition that he had when he in the previous war. The Dutch flooded their countryside by opening their dikes and preventing France and eventually England from being able to invade Holland. They stopped his invasion as a result of that. This will lead to the Peace of Nijmegen, 1678 to 79, which represented a limit of expansion under Louis XIV, at least for a time. France took back the Franche-Comté from Spain, however, and they did gain some Flemish towns. They also took Alsace back as well. The Nine Years' War, 1688 to 1697. Louis launched another invasion of the Spanish Netherlands in 1683. In response, the League of Augsburg formed in 1686, which included the Holy Roman Emperor or the Austrian Emperor, Spain, Sweden, Bavaria, Saxony, and the Dutch Republic, all against Louis. This demonstrated the emergence of balance of power. All of these nations were more concerned about the growth of French power and Louis's power than they were about the fact that some were Catholic and some were Protestant. William of Orange, who by this point had become King of England, again, we'll talk more about how that happens later, he brought England into the war against France and initiated a period of Anglo-French military rivalry that will last until Napoleon's defeat in 1815. Now, as we know, the French and the English have had a hate-hate relationship for centuries by this point. They have fought numerous wars, including that Hundred Years' War, that will continue as we go through them. But it heated up really badly once Louis XIV came to the throne. The war ultimately ended with the status quo prior to the war beginning, almost like a draw, neither side really coming out with a definitive victory. However, France did remain in control of Alsace, which was important to them, and the city of Strasbourg in Lorraine. Alsace and Lorraine are always territories that on the border of France, that borders the German territories on the eastern side of France, that they will always want to maintain control over. They will have Alsace and Lorraine for part of history. They will lose it in some wars. They will gain it back. They will lose it. They will gain it back. Back and forth, back and forth. We'll talk about this as we go through these units throughout the year. The War of Spanish Succession is probably the most important, I guess you would say, of the wars of Louis, even though it's not really a definitive victory. There are some victories that come out of it for Louis XIV, however. Goes on between 1701 and 1713. The cause was the will of the Spanish Habsburg King Charles II. The will gave all Spanish territories to the grandson of Louis XIV. And the reason why is because Louis XIV's wife had been Charles II's sister. So there was a family line there. Now, Charles II, as King of Spain, died without an heir. By this point, the Habsburgs had intermarried so much that he was unable to have children. He was impotent. And ultimately, the next person in line for the throne, the closest blood relative to Charles II, was Louis XIV's grandson, because that would mean he would have been the great grand nephew or something like that of King Charles II. So anyways, this was a big problem, especially for the German Habsburgs, who felt like, no, we can't have a French, even though he has some Habsburg blood in him, a Frenchman on the throne in Spain, then we'll lose our position of power there. Anyhow, the other European powers also didn't want this because they thought, does this mean that France will control Spain and Spain will become part of a greater French empire? So, these European powers feared that Louis would consolidate the thrones of France and Spain, thus creating a monster power that would upset the balance of power in Europe. So, the Grand Alliance was formed and emerged in opposition to France. It consisted of England, the Dutch Republic, the Holy Roman Empire or the Austrian Empire, Brandenburg, which becomes Prussia, Portugal, and Savoy. Ultimately, it became a war of attrition that dragged on for about 12 years, and it will end with the Treaty of Utrecht. This will be the most important treaty in Europe since 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia. There will be a later important treaty in 1763, the Treaty of Paris, that we'll talk about that ends the Seven Years' War. We'll talk about that in a later unit. That's another important balance of power treaty as well. So, how is the Treaty of Utrecht a balance of power treaty? Let's talk about how that is. First of all, it ends the expansionist policies of Louis XIV. The Spanish Empire, however, will be divided, will be partitioned. Britain becomes the biggest winner by gaining territories from Spain's empire overseas. They gain the Asiento from Spain as well. Gibraltar and Minorca will now be parts of the British Empire, and the Spanish Netherlands would be given to Austria. The Netherlands also gains lands as a buffer against France. Though Louis's Bourbon grandson was enthroned in Spain, that is this is a compromise of sorts. All of those lands from Spain will be given to those other nations, but Louis was allowed to put his grandson on the throne in Spain. But the unification of the Spanish and French Bourbon dynasties would be prohibited by the Treaty of Utrecht. The kings were formally recognized also in Sardinia or Savoy and in Prussia, which used to be called Brandenburg. They became the nucleus of the future unified states of Italy and Germany. We'll talk about those much later, not until the 19th century. So, what I said there is that Louis's grandson was able to become the king of Spain, but it was prohibited for Spain and France to ever be ruled together. So therefore, it was a compromise. Here is Europe in 1714. The balance of power has been restored after the wars of Louis. The costs of Louis XIV's wars are great. Ultimately, these wars are responsible for destroying the French economy due to a severe disruption of trade, which was a result of it. 20% of French subjects died fighting in these wars. A huge debt would also be placed on the shoulders of the Third Estate. The French government was on the verge of bankruptcy by the time Louis XIV dies. These financial and social tensions sowed the seeds of the French Revolution later in the century that ultimately would come to a head under Louis XVI's reign. So, ultimately, the wars of Louis XIV set the stage for an eventual revolution to happen in France that will set the monarchy on its head. Key concept: Spanish absolutism and decline. Now let's talk about this. We've been talking a little bit about the decline of the Spanish economy in the 17th century. When the wealth from the New World started to dry up, the Spanish who had not invested in their own industries at home suffered greatly. Then you have all the costs of these wars and the failures in these wars. It was costly. The Spanish economy was hurt by the loss of the middle class, the Moors and the Jews that were expelled by the earlier Queen Isabella with her Spanish Inquisition. The population of Spain shrank from 7.5 million in 1550 to 5.5 million in 1660. Spanish trade with its colonies also fell 60% between 1610 and 1660. This was largely due to English and Dutch competition. They started to challenge Spain's dominance of the Atlantic trade, and they started to win. The Spanish treasury was bankrupt and had to repudiate its debts at various times between 1594 and 1680. National taxes hit the peasantry particularly hard. Many peasants were driven from the countryside and swelled the ranks of the poor in the cities of Spain. Food production decreased as a result, which just added insult to injury. Inflation, also from the price revolution, hurt domestic industries that were unable to export goods because there weren't enough goods being produced because not enough domestic industries were invested in. Instead, they spent their money before that they had coming in on foreign goods. Now that that money's no longer coming in, they've reached a crisis point. A poor work ethic stunted economic growth also. Upper classes kind of looked down on work, they eschewed work and continued a life of luxury. Many noble titles were purchased, which provided tax exemptions for themselves and ultimately passed on the tax burden to the lower classes who were already suffering greatly. Capitalism was far less prevalent in Spain than it was in the Netherlands and England, and therefore they were not investing in their own industries, and ultimately this led to a decline in the economy as well. Political and military decline also were a result of this. Symbolically, England's defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 was once seen by some historians as the beginning of the end, if you will, or the beginning of the decline of the Spanish Empire. However, Spain had the most formidable military really still until the middle of the 17th century. By the time the 30 Years' War ends, Spain really has lost its real position of power. Poor leadership by three successive kings in the 17th century damaged Spain's political power. Philip III, Philip IV, and Charles II, who was one of the worst rulers in Habsburg history. Inbreeding may have played a role. All three of these kings had been the result of Habsburg inbreeding, if you will, and many of them were not right in the head as a result of Spain's defeat in the 30 Years' War under Philip IV was politically and economically disastrous. Spain officially lost the Netherlands. In 1640, Portugal reestablished its independence from Spain, and the Treaty of the Pyrenees, 1659, marked the end of Spain as a great power. The war between Spain and France continued for 11 years after the end of the 30 Years' War, and Spain lost parts of the Spanish Netherlands and territory in northern Spain to France as a result. By 1700, the Spanish Navy had only 8 ships, and most of its army consisted of foreigners. The War of Spanish Succession that happened between 1701 and 1713 saw Spain lose most of its European possessions at the Treaty of Utrecht. They also lost a lot of their imperial possessions to England and the Dutch.